Chapter 9 of the American Plague. A delicate situation. Monday, October 28th. George Washington has been impatient since his departure from Philadelphia in early September. When he left the stricken city, he had put Secretary of War Henry Knox in charge of the government, giving the former general clear instructions to report to him weekly concerning the spread of yellow fever. But after a few days' close contact with the pestilence, Knox found that his warrior instinct had abandoned him. He closed up his house and fled to across New Jersey to Manhattan Island. Knox was turned away from Manhattan and wound up in Elizabethtown, New Jersey, where he spent 2 weeks in quarantine. Woo, just like us. He did write to Washington, telling the president that the militia was out all over New Jersey hunting for fever victims, and that Manhattan was still in a state of panic over the possibility that the fever would visit there, but he provided no useful information about the fever in Philadelphia. Washington's own efforts to find out what was going on did not produce satisfying results either, especially for a man who wanted to be kept informed about all matters. I would thank you for precise information on this head, for I have not been able to get any, he wrote to a comptroller of the Treasury, Oliver Wolcott. Wolcott was one of the only 3 high-ranking officials of the federal government within a day's ride of Philadelphia, Attorney General Edmund Randolph and Postmaster General Timothy Pickering being the others. But these men were struggling to keep their departments functioning and had little spare time to gather information or write reports, even for the leader of their country. The few pieces of information the president did obtain were often second or third hand and usually vague in nature. The accounts we receive here, he lamented, are so opposite and unsatisfactory that we know not on what to rely. It was, Washington complained, a delicate situation for a president to be placed in. Adding to his frustration was the fact that very few official papers made their way to him at Mount Vernon. Washington was a stickler for orderly files that he could search at a moment's notice. This was the most important way he kept himself informed about the hundreds of things happening in the fledgling nation. Unfortunately, when the government clerks had panicked and dashed from Philadelphia, they had abandoned the papers and records in boarded-up houses. No one knew where these documents were, and no one was willing to risk his or her life wandering through an infected city to search for them. Washington did his best to answer questions and make decisions, but he often found his efforts blocked. At one point, Thomas Sim Lee, the governor of Maryland, wanted to know what he should do with the British ship Roehampton, which had been seized by one of Gannett's hired privateers and brought to Baltimore Harbor. The British were upset over the seizure and wanted their ship back, while the French were upset that the ship was being detained until the president could decide what to do. A very embarrassed George Washington finally had to confess to Lee, "I brought no public papers of any sort, not even the rules which have been established in these cases, along with me. Consequently, I am not prepared at this place in time to decide points which may require a reference to papers not within my reach." To make matters worse for Washington, the question about whether he could legally call Congress into session outside of Philadelphia was still very much up in the air. He had sought advice on the issue from a number of cabinet members and government officials, but no agreement had been reached. Alexander Hamilton felt the president could indeed move Congress. After all, Hamilton reasoned, the government would not automatically cease to function if an enemy army captured the capital. Why wouldn't the same principle apply in the case of a devastating natural disaster, such as a plague? But Thomas Jefferson and James Madison disagreed and could not be budged from their position. During the formation of the federal government, they argued individual states had been extremely wary about giving too much of their governing power to any future president. Their nervousness was a result of British history. English kings had allowed their subjects to participate in making laws, though through representatives of Parliament. This system of government worked as long as the king was not challenged on important matters. Whenever the Parliament clashed with their monarchs, kings would get his way by suddenly convening Parliament in a remote, unreachable part of the country. Without a proper quorum of members, the king could then decide laws as he pleased. As a result, representatives of the United States had drawn up a constitution with particular attention to the issue of where they would meet in the future. As far as Jefferson and Madison were concerned, only Congress could relocate itself, and it could do this only after officially convening in Philadelphia. Finally, Washington turned to Attorney General Edmund Randolph as the nation's chief law official and legal counsel of the United States. Randolph was someone whose opinion held great weight. In a delicately worded letter, Randolph told Washington that no, the president could not move Congress, even in an emergency. It seems to be unconstitutional, Randolph noted. If a federal government was to continue to operate, then Congress would have to meet in Philadelphia, whether or not a deadly fever was still present. Toward the end of October, Washington heard from Postmaster General Pickering that the fever seemed to be on the wane. A cold spell had swept in, and with it a cleansing rain. Burials were falling in number, from a high of 120 on October 11th to half that number on October 21st. The good news was followed almost immediately by a contradictory report from Comptroller Wolcott. After several good days in the city, he explained, warmer weather reappeared and deaths increased, jumping to 82 on October 22nd. Wolcott advised the president to delay his return trip for several more days. Clearly, the city was not yet safe. This did not please the anxious president, who was already been out of touch with critically important matters for over 6 weeks. He could write back and ask again about what was happening in the city, but this would take an unbearable amount of time. Before the fever, a letter could travel by fast post from his home to the city, and a reply could be received in 3 to 6 days. That's fast. 3 to 6 days for one letter. Now, letters to and from Philadelphia had to undergo special processing, such as being dipped in vinegar and allowed to dry. This was taking mail anywhere from 10 days to 2 weeks to make the journey these days. Further delay was out of the question. On October 28th, Washington climbed aboard a coach and headed north, accompanied by Tobias Lear and a valet. The president described his 5-day trip in one simple business-like sentence: set out from Mount Vernon on the 28th of October and arrived in Germantown on the 1st of November. Thomas Jefferson was also returning to Philadelphia area to complete his time as Secretary of State. He joined up with Washington in Baltimore. Unlike the president, Jefferson had a great deal to say about his journey, about the heat, rain, dust, and expense. Because no coaches were running north of Baltimore, the president and his Secretary of State were forced to hire, at their own expense, Jefferson grumped, a carriage to take them to Germantown. All along the way, Jefferson chafed about the jump in prices brought about by harpies who prey upon travelers returning to Philadelphia. Inns on the route had upped their rates. Ferrymen were charging extra to transport people and carriages across the river. In the end, Jefferson estimated that it cost him nearly $80 just to get to Germantown. That's a crazy amount back then. His annoyance continued even after he reached his destination. The 7 inns around the village were still jammed with folk who had left Philadelphia, and a few larger houses in the area were already filled with guests. The prior arrangement, Washington went to stay at the elegant and comfortable home of David Deschler. Jefferson, on the other hand, had to beg a proprietor of the Kings of Prussia Tavern for a place to sleep. Even then, he did not get a furnished room. We must give $4 to $6 to $8 a week, he complained, for a closet without a bed, a chair, or a table. Jefferson did well to find a private space and crammed as crammed and bare as it was. The two congressmen and future president, James Madison and James Monroe, would arrive after him and be compelled to sleep on wooden benches in the tavern's public room. What Washington and the others discovered was that despite the surge of deaths on October 22nd, the fever did indeed seem to be losing strength. Deaths fell from below 30 on Saturday, October 26th. Dr. Benjamin Rush looked about his neighborhood that day and found that there was not a single person ill on his block. The disease visibly and universally declines, he wrote to Julia, his confidence returning. Elizabeth Drinker opened her front door and found a delightful, cool, frosty morning, she added. It is generally agreed that the fever is very much abated. The committee, meanwhile, noted a lessening in demands for their assistance and passed a resolution saying it has passed divine providence to favor us with an agreeable prospect of returning health to our long-afflicted city. The fever wasn't completely gone, the committee was quick to confess, but it would be safer for our fugitive brethren to return within a week to 10 days. People who had hidden themselves indoors began to emerge and walk the streets again. Shop doors opened for business, and ships once again sailed upriver to discharge of cargo. Farmers arrived, their wagons uploaded, with provisions bound for markets of a very hungry city. Plans were even announced for the resumption of a stagecoach in early November. The city seemed to be awakening after a long, inescapable nightmare. Andrew Brown, the editor of the Federal Gazette, devoted an optimistic paragraph to the dawn of returning health and order. Most doctors had predicted the fever would end when the cold weather returned. Almost all epidemics followed the same pattern, striking during warmer weather, disappearing with the first hard frosts. Daniel Defoe, in recording of the end of the Black Death that visited London in 1665, wrote that the winter weather came on pace, and most of those that had fallen sick recovered, and the healthy city began to return. The same was true in Philadelphia in 1793. The number of deaths would go above 20 only twice after October 20th. Those who had escaped the city began to trickle back home. Every hour, Matthew Carey observed with relief, long absent and welcome faces appear. Those returning to the city found it a changed place. The streets were remarkably clean, for one. The trash and garbage had been swept away. Dead animals, cats, dogs, birds, and pigs had been removed too. Gone, too, were the beggars and homeless children. Most changed of all were those who had been left behind. The survivors were exhausted, haggard-looking, their clothes frayed and soiled, smelling heavily of vinegar and camphor. The skin of many who had gotten the fever retained a sickly yellow glow. Those who had taken the mercury purge were constantly spitting to rid their mouths of a foul taste that the drug had left behind. When they smiled, their teeth were stained an unsightly black. These reminders of the yellow fever did not shake the spirit of optimism that gripped the city. Raynard Taylor announced that he would be printing an anthem suitable to the present occasion. Thomas Boylston Adams, son of Vice President John Adams, wrote to his nervous parents in Quincy, Massachusetts, "The idea of danger is dissipated in a moment when we perceive thousands walking in perfect security around the customary business, and no ill consequence ensuing from it." In the very last day of October, a huge white flag was hoisted at Bush Hill to proclaim, "No more sick persons here." The fever was gone. Folk around town declared happy. And then, even in defiance of the cold weather and dusting of snow, several of the recently returned residents developed symptoms of the disease. The silversmith, known only as Mr. Brooks, reopened his shop in October 31st and was dead of yellow fever on October 3rd. Others fell ill as well. While these new incidences of yellow fever were few and scattered, they demonstrated clearly that the disease had not been completely wiped out. It still lurked in dark, unclean corners, still clung in dirty sheets and curtains. Once again, the carts carried the sick to Bush Hill, and a white flag of victory had to be hauled down. The committee issued a public warning telling recent arrivals to clean their homes thoroughly, burn gunpowder to purify the air, dump lime down their privies, and whitewash every room. The reemergence of the deadly disease did not stop people from returning to the city. It did, however, leave a lingering sense of helplessness. Well into December, individuals were still succumbing to the fever, and Thomas Jefferson was worrying over which houses were safe to enter. Yellow fever, he predicted, will discourage the growth of great cities in the nation. One of the last diary entries Elizabeth Drinker made concerning the plague spoke of the unshakable unease of the invisible killer that it had left in its wake. M.D. observed, while at her sister's this afternoon, a coffin, a cart, and 10 or 20 persons walking on ye pavement as attendants. 'Tis to be feared that ye yellow fever is not entirely over. On Sunday morning, November 10th, George Washington mounted his horse and rode out of Germantown without bothering to wake his aides. Tired of not knowing the true condition of Philadelphia and frustrated by the general nervousness of everyone around him, Washington took it upon himself to make an inspection. Down the 5 miles Washington traveled, through forests and past scattered farmhouses and fields, over the small bridge covering Peg Run, until he entered the city. He spent the next while riding up one street and down another, nodding politely to the people he happened to encounter at the early hour. The air smelled fine, the streets were clean and orderly. Aside from the tiny red flags stuck on houses, there were no outward sign of the fever anywhere. He rode back to Germantown later that day to tell his shocked staff where he had been. Best of all, he informed them that the nation's capital was healthy enough for Congress to meet there in December, as planned. The city filled up again and took on its normal pre-plague place. The markets bustled with activity. The taverns and coffee houses buzzed with conversation. The federal, state, and local governments took up the business they had left off in September. Benjamin Rush emerged from the epidemic emaciated, feeble, and haunted. In a letter to Julia, he expressed that what was probably on the minds of many of those who had stayed and survived. Sometimes, seated in your easy chair by the fire, he wrote, I lose myself in looking back upon the ocean which I have passed, and now and then find myself surprised by a tear in reflecting upon the friends I have lost, and the sense of distress that I have witnessed, and which I am unable to relieve. No one would ever know precisely how many Philadelphians died of the yellow fever in 1793. Many of those who traditionally kept such count, ministers, sextons, and city officials, had either fled the city or been ill themselves. The best estimates put the number of victims at between 4,000 and 5,000 men, women, and children. What was clear to all was that life would never be the same. The fear had gone too deep and losses too real and personal. That is the end of chapter 9.